Thank you for coming out. I'm Claire Dederer, is how you say my last name, and I so appreciate you being here, and thank you to the university for having me, and to Nina. I'm really excited that, I don't know how many people here, if anyone, are involved in this monsters class? Is anybody? Okay. Okay, so there's a class at the university who's studying what I'm currently writing a book about, which is why I'm here. I'm going to go talk to them this afternoon, which is what do we do with the Art of Monstrous Men? So that's the subject matter I'm talking about today. And I was asked to introduce myself, which I think is funny, so I'm going to read my own biography. Claire Dederer is the author of two critically, oh, see, then it's really great, okay. Critically acclaimed memoirs, Love and Trouble, and Poser, which was a New York Times bestseller. Poser has been translated into 11 languages, optioned for television by Warner Brothers, and adapted for the stage. I didn't know I put this in my bio. Dederer is at work on Monsters, a non-fiction book investigating good art made by bad people, forthcoming from Knopf. The book is based on her 2017 essay for the Paris Review, What Do We Do with the Art of Monstrous Men? The essay went globally viral, was a Longform best essay of the year, and has been cited repeatedly as one of the most influential pieces of writing on the Me Too movement to date. I'm a longtime contributor to the New York Times. I've written for Vogue, Slate, Salon, The Nation, The Atlantic, and many, many other magazines. I've made my living as a freelance writer for 20 years. And I was a film critic at the Seattle Weekly before that. I teach the MFA program at Pacific University in Oregon. And I live on Bainbridge Island near Seattle with my family. But today we are not here to talk about me, we are here to talk about terrible men. How many of you are English students, humanities students? And, okay, that's interesting. I don't know, are a lot of you from the medical school, or? Interesting. Okay, that's very interesting. Thank you. So I'm going to jump right in. Roman Polanski, Woody Allen, Bill Cosby, William Burroughs, Richard Wagner, Kanye, Sid Vicious, V.S. Naipaul, John Galliano, Norman Mailer, Ezra Pound, Caravaggio, Floyd Mayweather, but if we talk about sports figures, we will never ever stop listing people. And what about women? When we start to list women, the list becomes mysterious and sort of tentative. Anne Sexton, Joan Crawford, Sylvia Plath. Does it count if you only hurt yourself? Okay, back to the men. Pablo Picasso, Kevin Spacey, Lead Belly, Miles Davis, Phil Spector, Louis C.K., Jeffrey Tambor, which was one that really broke my heart. They all did or said something awful, and they made something great. The awful thing disrupts the great work. We can't watch or listen to or read the great work without remembering the awful thing. There's this sense in which a statement or an action, basically what's biographical information about this artist, happens, and we get it into our heads, and it makes it so the work is changed forever. We were talking about Sherman Alexie when you all came in, and he had accusations of sexual misconduct, a very beloved writer forever. And those accusations have changed the way people read his work, both in the sense that fewer people are reading his work because they feel uncomfortable, but also when you actually go to look at the work, is it somehow changed? Does it read differently when you know that this incredibly sensitive novelist has done this totally insensitive thing? How is the work changed by that knowledge? So I've been asking for a few years now, what do we do about the Art of Monstrous Men? I published this essay a year ago in the Paris Review, but I've been asking it for a long time. I wasn't responding to the cultural moment of Weinstein. What happened was about 7 years ago, I started writing a memoir book called Love and Trouble. And a thread or a motif through that book was Roman Polanski. And I was writing about him as this sort of figure of the sexually predatory 70s. You know, he did this crime where he anally raped a 13-year-old. And so I wrote a lot about that rape in this book, Love and Trouble. And I researched it a lot. I learned a lot about it. I read the depositions of the rape. I know every detail of it. I know it in voice. I knew what she said. So I have a really intimate knowledge, as almost as intimate as his biographer probably has, of what happened for this crime he was convicted of, and then he fled the country. And then I finished writing the book, and I was left with a problem. I had all this knowledge of what he had done, and I still loved the work. I don't know how many people have seen Chinatown or Rosemary's Baby or Repulsion. Anybody seen any of those films? Go watch them. They're amazing. I mean, unless you yourself cannot stomach the contrast between what he did and what he made. But Rosemary's Baby, I've watched a couple times, the documentary I'm working on last year. I think it's one of the best films of the 20th century. Same thing, Chinatown is often called the greatest film ever made. So here, that's why Roman Polanski is really the central figure of this argument. What he did is, he was convicted of it, he wasn't just accused of it, and what it was heinous what he did. And yet what he made is, by all accounts, really great. So I was left with this problem. I knew what he'd done, and I still loved the work. But I didn't know what to do about it. And I became really interested in this question. What happens, what should I do about it? And also, what happens when I watch his work? Am I forgetting what he did? Am I taking it on board? What's my relationship to the work as I'm watching? So I became fascinated by the idea of writing an autobiography of the audience. The book I'm working on is called Monsters, and it's about monsters of art, but it's really as much about us as it is about them. What happens to us? What's our dynamic with the artist? So I'm working on that book, and it will come out from Knopf next year, and I'm going to read a few passages from it as I go, but mostly I'm going to describe the problem and talk about my relationship to it. The problem isn't that just that the person did a horrible thing. It's, as I said, relating to to Polanski's work, it's that we love the work. And so it's a contrast between two emotions, an emotion of hatred of what the person did and love of the work. And I think a lot about this conversation I saw my daughter have a couple years ago. She was super into this band called Power Body. Has anybody heard them? Great band, really, really good band, very punk rock. We all got really into them for a while, very queer identified. So they were a band that a lot of teenagers, a lot of queer teenagers and teenage allies got really into, and they would play at small queer punk clubs all over America. They had a really tight-knit audience. Kids were super into them and really supportive of them and let them into what was a really vulnerable community, right? And the first album was amazing. The second album was getting ready to drop. NPR had done a big story on them and previewed the album. The day before the album was supposed to come out, the sexual assault accusations started coming in. And they were totally queer identified, and the accusations were from girls. So there was a double sense of betrayal. And the kids were really hurt. I mean, these are vulnerable kids. A lot of them lived their lives a lot on the internet, and they were really upset. They have these really strong fan communities, and it was a bad situation. So a year after that happened, my daughter and I were going out for crepes. And we went into a little crepe shop on our island, and there was another girl from our high school making crepes, like spreading the stuff on the crepe iron, and they were chatting, and I was listening, because I always am interested in what teenagers are saying. And they started talking about Power Bottom, and they were saying, the other girl, Kelsey, said, "Do you still listen to him?" And my daughter, Lucy, said, "Yeah, I still listen to him." And Kelsey said, "I listen to him too." And she just looked so sad, and then she said this amazing sentence. She said, "Even after everything." And to me, that's the most powerful sentence I've heard on this subject, that we can know what we know, and even after everything, the love is still there. That's what makes this an interesting problem. So we immediately go to pragmatics. We want to solve a practical problem. But there's this larger problem of what happens to the work itself. Is it changed by our knowledge of what these people did? Is it disrupted? So for me, the obvious kind of case that brings most people together is the case of Woody Allen. Does anybody here have a position on Woody Allen, like whether or not you won't see his films? Yeah, 2 people do. When you bring up this topic of horrible people who make great art, Woody Allen is often what people's minds go to. And I made a little list of things people say to me. I could never go see a Woody Allen movie. I don't care what he did, I love his movies. I'm just glad the movies are terrible. terrible now because I don't have to worry about it. And Midnight in Paris was glorious, and I just put the other stuff out of my mind. So I don't know if any of that is familiar for you guys. I think he's one of the few people that people sort of have a worked idea about, where they've sort of thought about it and made a decision, because we've been processing the Soon Yi thing since 96, I think? Maybe, no, earlier than that, more like 93. So there's a lot. Woody Allen's problematic because there's so many things he's been accused of, because he's part of this gigantic, brilliant melange of people, all of whom seem to have their own agenda, and who knows what's going on with the Farrow-Allen situation. But what we do know, aside from the accusations of incest, is that Woody Allen did sleep with Soon Yi Previn, who was, at the time, the child of his life partner, Mia Farrow. Soon Yi was a teenager, and she was arguably in his care at this time. I sort of feel like she was. And he, meanwhile, was the most famous film director on earth. So that much we do know, aside from all the other stuff that's gone down since then. When that news came out, I took it, this was sort of the original case where we had to deal with this idea of someone we loved as a monster. And when the news came out, I took it really personally. I loved Woody Allen, and I really related to him. I felt like he represented something about me as a kid and a powerless person. He was short, he was, sort of, things didn't go his way, he complained a lot, I was all those things, I loved him. And when I heard that he was not one of the powerless people, but was a predator, that conflict was almost intolerable for me. And I did take it very personally. I continued to watch his films because I was professionally a film critic, so I had to see that I was affected by this. And when I started writing about this Monsters of Art issue, and once I had exhausted thinking about Polanski, I turned next to Woody Allen, and I wanted to see if the old films would hold up. Could I bear it? What would it feel like? So the first one I watched was Annie Hall. Has anybody seen Annie Hall? Everybody seen Annie Hall? So Annie Hall's a beautiful film. I have called it in print the best comedy of the 20th century, so fight me. And it's Woody Allen's anxiety and existential crisis sort of expressed, but also displaced into the person of Diane Keaton, who won an Oscar. She gave the performance of her career. It's a beautiful film. It's a sort of combination of the heavy weight of despair about the human condition and this incredibly glistening bubble of a love story. So these two things are in dynamic, and it just turns out to be a great film. And it was no problem to watch it. I ate some snickerdoodles, I lay on my couch, I watched the film. It was, on TV. And that was fine. And so I thought, well, I need to watch the rest of the films, and so I can write about Woody Allen as part of this book. So basically, I watched all the Woody Allen films, which is a lot, because some were good and some were bad. But after a while, I started to notice what I was doing. What I was doing was avoiding watching Manhattan. That was pretty much what the project was for me at this point, was avoiding watching Manhattan. So I watched all the films. And so maybe a lot of you don't know, because you're young, you don't know the plot of Manhattan. But in it, Woody Allen is in his early 40s, and he is having a relationship, not just an affair, but an ongoing relationship with a 17-year-old high school student who is played by 16-year-old Mariel Hemingway, who in fact had her first kiss during the filming of the movie with Woody Allen, which is just beyond. So that is the sort of central premise of the film. It also so happens that this one particular film, out of all the great films Woody Allen has made, gets called his masterpiece, which is really interesting. And we're going to kind of take that idea and set it aside till later. But it's a fascinating thing. So you can see how, now in time, we're in the summer of 2017, I'm writing this book about Monsters of Art, and it's time to watch Woody Allen. And think back to the summer of 2017. It wasn't the greatest summer ever. Speaking as a feminist and a woman, it was kind of a stressful time. It was before the Weinstein allegations came out, but there was just this roiling sense of unease. And so I wrote a little bit about the mood of that summer. The mood of that summer was one of extreme discomfort, just a general feeling of not quite rightness. People, and by people I mean women, were unsettled and unhappy. They met on the streets and looked at one another and shook their heads and walked away wordlessly. I actually did that. The women had had it. The women went on a giant fed-up march. The women were Facebooking and tweeting, going for long, furious walks, giving money to the ACLU, wondering why their partners and children didn't do the dishes more. The women were realizing the invidiousness of the dishwashing paradigm. The women were becoming radicalized, even though the women really did not have time to be radicalized. Arlie Russell Hochschild, do people know her work? First published The Second Shift in 1989, which was about how women do two jobs, the domestic job and their actual job. And in 2017, the women were discovering that shit was truer than ever. In a couple months would come the Harvey Weinstein accusations and then the free-fall pig pile of the Me Too campaign. As I wrote in my diary when I was a teen, I don't feel great about men right now. I still didn't feel great about men in the summer of 2017, and a lot of other women didn't feel great about men either. A lot of men didn't feel great about men. Even the patriarchs were sick of patriarchy. And incredibly, I wrote this in the fall of 2017, and it's hard to believe how much angrier I am now. I had thought that was a historical moment. At any rate, that was the cultural moment that surrounded me when I lay down on the couch again to finally confront watching Manhattan. And it was a really burdensome truth that at that moment, as I was watching it, CNN was broadcasting reports from the first Cosby trial. So those two things were happening at the same time. So I sat down to watch the film, and the opening credits are incredible. He shows the New York skyline. He really is probably the greatest filmmaker of his generation. He shows the opening skyline, it's the credits over Manhattan. Gershwin is playing, there's these jump cuts, and things are cutting in time for the Gershwin music in a way that's like buoyant and hilarious and charming, and the feeling that you feel is love. It's a connection to humanity, which is what great art does. It connects us to humanity, to our humanity. And you sense his mastery, you sense his genius, you're lifted as you watch the credits, the opening. And then the first scene comes. And the opening scene, shot in beautiful, tasteful, Bergman-inspired black and white, could not be more tasteful. 4 people having dinner. They're probably at Elaine's, the most genteel, civilized kind of circumstance in the world. 4 people out for dinner in New York. There's Isaac, who's that Woody Allen character. There's his best friend, Yale, which don't even get me started. There's Yale's wife, Emily, so they're all in their 40s. And then there's Isaac's girlfriend, who's a high school student. And these 4 people continue eating their dinner, and it's just fine. It's no big deal. Isaac is dating and having sex with this high schooler with what my mother would call a hey nonny nonny. It's just off he goes. It's not a big deal at all. And the film continues very much in that vein. It continues with, occasionally he's like, I'm dating a girl who has homework, this is crazy. But that's about as deep as the exploration of the problem. The problem of what's happening on film does not get touched. And this is from a director whose work approaches the great novelists when he's on point. There's this way in which his work can be like the work of Flaubert or other really important novelists when you think of Hannah and Her Sisters or Crimes and Misdemeanors. And these are really great, nuanced, thoughtful pieces of work that plunder the moral complexities of different situations, except in the one film where he's a teenager, right? And then it's just this surface movement, it never deals with it. And it's fascinating because when Alan talked, years later when he became involved with Sun Yi, he gave this very famous interview to Walter Isaacson of Time magazine, who was saying, how could you do this? You left Mia Farrow for Mia Farrow's child, he was a teenager. And he said, the heart wants what it wants, right? Like it's a line we've never forgotten. It's this monstrous disregard for the person, for anything but the self. It's proudly irrational. This coming from a man that I've read, hundreds of pages of interviews with and is the most deeply articulate filmmaker I've probably ever read. The heart wants what it wants. End of conversation. The most terse interview ever. So this fascinating refusal to engage around the problem, and the movie upset me deeply. I was really, really upset by it, watching it at that moment in time as the mother of a 17-year-old, thinking about my own life experiences. And so I was starting to write about it, and because I am who I am, and I have the compulsions I have, I started to post about it on social media. I was like, oh my God, watching Manhattan while the Cosby trials are on, I'm feeling a little irpy. And I had this response. I mean, I have said outrageous things on social media. I'm very, I talk about the Society for Cutting Out Men. Like, I engage with very radical feminist ideas in a very constant way. I said Manhattan made me feel a little irpy, and there was like a firestorm in my social media. Men went into a tizzy. They could not handle it. People unfollowed and unfriended me and flamed me and took against me just for this one little post saying it made me feel irpy. And then I went out for dinner with a friend who's a very prominent literary critic in New York, and these men who were storming off my page were just like, you're not getting it, Claire. You're just sucking in for some subjective reality. The objective truth is it's a great film. It's aesthetically great, objectively speaking, and you're being okay, I never know how to say this word, I think it's funny. It's Philistine or Philistine? Anyone? It's not a test, I think it's Philistine. So, that you're being one of those, right? Like, you're not being a nuanced grown-up, you're being childish, you can't watch this film. So that was sort of the first iteration of the men responding, and it kept happening. Men kept getting me in trouble for not liking Manhattan. I went out to dinner with this prominent critic friend in New York, and he said, we were talking about our work, and I said, I watched Manhattan again, it really doesn't hold up. Thinking about the lack of nuance and the way that Alan was not up to his usual form of exploring social mores. He kind of went into this sort of dumb mode in the film, I felt. And my friend said, oh, I'm so disappointed in you. I would have expected more of you. The film is objectively, aesthetically great. And I was like, I'm telling you it's not, and here's why. And he said, you're just letting Sun Yi color your experience of the film. As if that's necessarily, my problem. And I said, maybe, but it's just not good. And he just shut me down. The objective truth was the film was good, and I was wrong. But I have to ask, which of us was seeing more clearly? The one who had the ability, and some might say the privilege, the man, to remain untroubled by the filmmaker's attitudes toward girls and females and women. The one who had the ability to watch the art without committing a biographical fallacy, right? He's telling me I'm committing a biographical fallacy. I'm confusing the art and the artist. But isn't it kind of a privilege to not do that? Maybe I was seeing more clearly. Maybe the person who couldn't help but notice the antipathies and urges that animated Woody Allen's project is actually the person seeing more clearly. The man comes to the piece of work with his own experience, and it often really closely matches the experience of the male filmmaker or writer. The woman comes with hers as well. One isn't more central or more true than the other. It's very hard to kind of know this in your heart, but I believe it. When I ask what to do about the Art of Monstrous Men, I write while sitting in the presence of the memory of monstrous things being done to me. That memory is a ghost in the room. I've been assaulted, I've been a teenager, predated by older men, I've been molested, I've escaped from intruders, I've been coerced. And of course there are dozens of other incursions that have happened to me. I have a list, just like every woman has a list, or most women have a list. This is my experience coming to this work. And perhaps it's what drives me to do the work. I'm not trying to get you to pity me. I don't need that. I'm only trying to be perfectly clear. I don't come to these questions with some kind of ahistorical or dispassionate point of view, and neither do the men who are arguing with me. Are they defending Woody Allen, or are they defending something else if they think his greatest film is the film where he's having sex with a teenager? I said I had this feeling, and they said wrong feeling. A great work of art does that. It brings us a feeling. And yet when I say Manhattan makes me feel irpy, a man says, no, not that feeling. You're having the wrong feeling. He speaks with authority. Manhattan is a work of genius. But who gets to say? Authority says the work shall remain untouched by the life. Authority says the biography is a fallacy. Authority believes that the work exists in an ideal state, ahistorical, snowy, pure, alpine. Authority ignores the natural feeling that arises from your biographical knowledge of the subject. We learn something. Kanye tweets this insane shit, and it changes our relationship to the work. We can't pretend it didn't happen. Authority claims it is able to appreciate the work free of biography, free of history. Authority sides with the male maker against the female audience. Me, I am not ahistorical or immune to biography. That is for winners of history, men so far. We all have mitigating personal experiences that change our relationship to the work. I don't even want to say mitigating is the wrong word. We have experiences that shape our relationship to the work, and that's different for all of us. So let's take Wagner as an example. A composer who's performed a lot in Europe and America. I'm happy his work is in the world. He has not been performed, except for very, very rarely, in Israel ever. Wagner does not get performed in Israel. Are they performing the biography? Because I don't know how much you know about Wagner. He's a terrible anti-Semite. So are they performing, is all of Israel performing the biographical fallacy, right? Are they just not able to get with the program and appreciate genius? Based on this idea of there being a freestanding, objective, aesthetic good that people who have a biographical problem with work need to just get on board with, Israel's just wrong from that point of view. And of course, Israel's not wrong. They're taking a principled stand and acknowledging the reality of Wagner's history. I'm not saying I'm right or wrong about Woody Allen. I'm not the person who brought rightness or wrongness into the dialogue. I just said how the film made me feel. And it's indisputable that I am the audience. I am the audience. You are the audience. And I'm acknowledging the realities of the situation. The film Manhattan is disrupted by our knowledge of Sunni, but it's pretty gross in its own right. It's also got a lot of things about it that are really great. All these things are true at once, but simply being told by men that Allen's history shouldn't matter doesn't achieve the objective of making it not matter. It matters to me. It matters when we know these things. It matters when we hear these things about Louis C.K. These things, they just do. We hear them and they affect us. Just saying ignore it doesn't make it go away. There's so what do we do? Does that mean that we stop watching? Obviously I don't think that. I'm consuming Polanski films. I'll still watch Woody Allen. I still listen to Kanye. But we need to consume this art without pretending there's no problem. And that's the audience responsibility. There's also a responsibility of institutions to change their relationships to these artists. So I just got a text from a friend yesterday. There's a guerrilla artist, a woman, in New York right now who's going around to the Met and MoMA. And you know how when there's a painting, there'll be like a little card next to it telling the history of the painting and the artist. She's going around and putting up another card next to it. So she's not defacing, she's adding. And the other card just says all the terrible shit the person did. So like if it's Picasso, it'll say, put out a cigarette on Dora's face, right? You get it. Is she saying take down the work? No. She's acknowledging that the work is important. But her point was that the museums are infantilizing us by pretending that we are unable to take in the work without, and ignore the knowledge. We get to have the knowledge and consume the work. Those two things can happen at once. We're grown-ups. We can do both things. We can hold both ideas in our heads. So, let's see what time it is. I think the institutional part of it is really important, but we come back to the personal response. What is it that we're feeling? What's going on when we look at this work? And as I started to read about it more and think about response more and the collective villainization that has happened, I became fascinated by the way that there was sort of a casting out of these men who made this work. There's a sort of collective demonizing of it, even though they're people. Sherman Alexie's a person. They're people who are troubled. Is Kanye off his meds? Who knows? These are troubled people. We've sort of fetishized them into being people who are supposed to live out our moral issues, but the fact is they're humans, so why do we demonize them when this stuff comes up? I do think, and we have these outrages over and over, and there's something kind of thrilling about denouncing the monster. You know, there's that idea of virtue signaling. We all sort of stand up and say, this is wrong. So what are we doing when we say that? You know, there's this sense in which maybe some of that has to do with something inside us that's not quite right. You know, maybe there's something going on where we sense an otherness or a monstrousness inside us. And there's this, you know, there's a look at how terrible he is because we're so horrified by what's inside us. And the Victorians were very, very good on this. You know, the Jekyll and Hyde and the picture of Dorian Gray really embraced this idea that there's something bad inside you that's going to come out one way. I mean, actually, I think it's a lot of Oscar Wilde deals with this, and that's a very complex issue. I do think the psychic theater of the public condemnation of monsters can be seen as a kind of elaborate misdirection. Like, I'm not the monster, you might want to look at that guy, right? So I became fascinated by this idea of not just monstrousness over there, but monstrousness that might exist in myself. And I have written 2 memoirs, and there's a sense in which if you're going to be an ambitious memoirist, and I would argue even a good memoirist, you need to practice, you know, very religiously the art of self-indictment. That's your job. If you're just writing about how great you are and how terrible other people are, that's like a bad, bad memoir, and it's actually morally bad as well. I think kind of going after what is problematic and uncomfortable in yourself is sort of the moral charge of the memoir, because when you say what is difficult and unsettling about yourself, then the reader is rendered less alone, right? You've made a connection to them and made them less lonely with whatever their self-hatred revolves around. So the idea of self-indictment is really important to me as a writer. And of course it came up as I started to write about monsters. And I asked myself, am I a monster? I've never killed anyone. Am I a monster? I've never promulgated fascism. Am I a monster? I did not molest a child. Am I a monster? I haven't been accused by dozens of women of drugging and raping them. Am I a monster? I don't beat my children yet. Am I a monster? I'm not noted for my anti-Semitism. Am I a monster? I've never presided over a sex cult where I trapped young women in a gilded Atlanta mansion and forced them to do my bidding. Am I a monster? I didn't anally rape a 13-year-old. Look at all the awful things I have not done. Maybe I'm not a monster. But I've bumped through life totting up my fair share of bad behavior and probably more. And we talk about that a little bit, the idea of this badness that you're misdirecting from. But I've done something else. I've written a book. I've written another book. I've written essays, articles, criticism. And maybe that makes me monstrous in an extremely specific kind of way. I'm just going to read for a little bit. The critic Walter Benjamin said, at the base of every major work of art is a pile of barbarism. My own work could hardly be called major, but I do wonder, at the base of every minor work of art, is there a, smaller pile of barbarism? A lump of barbarism? A skosh? There are many qualities one must possess to be a working writer or artist. Talent, brains, tenacity. Wealthy parents are good. You should definitely try to have those. But first among equals when it comes to ingredients is selfishness. A book is made out of small selfishnesses. The selfishness of shutting the door against your family, the selfishness of forgetting the real world to create a new one, the selfishness of unhad sex, the selfishness of being called parents, the selfishness of saving the best of yourself for that blank-faced, anonymous paramour, the reader. Sure, I possess the ordinary monstrousness of a real-life person, the unknowable depths, the suppressed high, but I also have a more visible, quantifiable kind of monstrousness, that of the artist who completes her work. Finishers are always monsters. Woody Allen doesn't just try to make a film a year, he tries to make out a film a year. This is an uncomfortable thought. It makes it sound like I'm saying it's the same thing to get a babysitter and go to work as it is to, say, assault an underling. I'm not saying that, but I am saying maybe there is some sense in which you need a kernel of monstrousness in order to get your work done. I'm no Polanski, but I can't help wondering if you need to be a bit of a monster to make anything at all, ever. And do great artists need more monstrousness? These questions are unanswerable, but I can't stop asking them. What is to be done with monsters? Can and should we love their work? Are all ambitious artists monsters? Am I a monster? I'm not sure where we're at. Do a little bit more. So, as I said, I first published these thoughts in this piece for the Paris Review. And in the piece, I landed hard, as I've talked about here, on the idea of both personal responsibility and a kind of elevating of subjective experience, right? We all come to a work of art from our own subjective experience, and that's really valid. Nobody can make a decision for someone else. And in this media climate right now, that's a really uncomfortable idea. What pieces of writing, what think pieces do now is tell you how you should be. They tell you how you should act. This is one of the deepest problems in our political, sexual, every kind of discourse right now is problematized by this kind of language. And my piece stepped back from that and wouldn't tell you what to do. It said, solve it for yourself. So the book, the essay did really well, and I did a lot of press on it. And so I went out and I was interviewed by radio people all over the world, and they would all ask me the same question. They read the essay, and then they would say, what should I do? And I just would laugh, and I wouldn't tell them, which was really hard. It's like, I'm not answering Ari Shapiro's question. That was rough. But I couldn't answer. You need to choose for yourself. And then I had this brainwave. I thought there could be an online calculator where you would go on this website and you would enter the name of the artist, and the calculator would assess the heinousness of the crime versus the greatness of the work. And then it would spit out a verdict, whether or not you could or consume the work of the artist. And I love this because it acknowledges there's no right answer. There are only wrong answers that we each give individually. And I'll just finish up by talking about where I'm going with the book, because Nina wanted me to talk a little bit about that. I've been writing on it for a really long time and thinking about it. And I was camping this summer, and my friend Johnny showed up at the fire pit. And he said, I've been thinking about your book. And he said, it made me think about my stepfather, Clyde. And Johnny's stepfather, Clyde, was a criminal. He was in prison. He was a pimp. They think he was a murderer, but they don't know. He was somebody who helped raise Johnny when he was in high school, and eventually he disappeared from Johnny's life. But they reunited a few years ago when they were adults. And then Clyde died, and Johnny's heart was broken. And Johnny was thinking about, I loved him. I couldn't help but love him. I knew he was awful. I knew he was a criminal. I knew that he was a bad person. And I loved him, and that didn't stop, and I knew it when he died. And that conversation changed the book for me that I'm writing. It made me able to step into a larger, more expansive questioning about the nature of human love. What do we do about not just the art of horrible people, but what do we do about horrible people we love? Because most people are, to some degree, horrible. And some are worse. We all know. We're all probably thinking of someone who's worse. The opening book, the What Do We Do with the Art part, is almost a kind of laboratory for thinking about a bigger and more essential question. What is it to love someone awful? Can we do it? Should we do it? And how awful can we get away with being before people stop loving us? And I'll wrap up there. So I'll do questions.